So I think I found, it's not automated, but it's a much larger capacity water fountain. I want to show you, see if you like it, because you mentioned you don't like this one. So I like the idea of having something that can be filled once every 3 to 6 days. Good girl, Bubba's. Good girl. Run, run, run. Run, Clea. Go. You're so fast.
This channel is part of the Secretary of State for War had called for an increment of 100,000 volunteers to supplement the forces of the regular army. Within a month, over 500,000 had volunteered. Men jostled in queues, sometimes miles long, outside the recruiting offices for a chance to do their bit for Britain. W.T. Collier enlisted at the headquarters of the Artists' Rifles at Duke Street in Euston. His decision had been passionate and spontaneous.
My bosom swelled, and I clenched my fist. I felt restless, excited, eager to do something desperate for the cause of England. And then the impulse came, sending the blood tingling all over my body. Why not join? Vitality, as I imagined, a man writing his troth to the girl he had loved at first sight.
Recruiting became a cultural imperative. Politicians stamped the country, inciting their listeners to orgies of patriotic sentiment. Posters screamed out slogans such as, "Women of Britain say go," or, most famous, "Your country needs you." Amateur and professional raisers sprang up, goading their audiences towards the recruiting stations with a potent oratory of passion and guilt. It was one of the most influential, one of these self-appointed agents, the Earl of Derby, who riveted the populations of Liverpool business offices with the assurance that we have Kitchener's personal guarantee that those who join together serve together to prove a stroke of propagandist genius. Units of pounds sprang up everywhere. Workplaces, football teams, villages, and clubs joined up en masse. The seeds of patriotism broadcast by the recruiters have fallen on the rich soil of a nation's conscience and fertilized by our traditional belief in its own decency. As C.L. Montague was to write of these volunteers after the war,
Each of them quite seriously thought of himself as a molecule in the body of a nation that was really, not just figuratively, straining every nerve to discharge an obligation of honor. All the air was ringing with rousing reassurances. France was saved, Belgium righted, freedom and civilization rewound. The South, soiled, crooked world was rid of bullies and crooks and reclaimed for straightness, decency, good nature, the ways of common men dealing with common men.
even though there were other factors in the rush to enlist, these were the sentiments embraced by the vast majority of the 3 million men who would eventually volunteer to fight. The frenzied response to the call for volunteers threw the whole supply structure of the armed forces into chaos. This new army had to be billeted, then trained and equipped. Uniforms were a luxury at first. Men were paid an allowance to continue to wear their civilian clothes. Rifles were also in short supply, and other equipment had to be substituted during their training, which was largely limited to drilling and war marching. The sight of these platoons of earnest young men tramping in unison along the roadways of Britain, some in the now disheveled Sunday suits they had joined up in, walking sticks slung menacingly across their shoulders, would hardly have struck fear into the battle-hardened hearts of the German troops holding the line of the Somme. In the end, training and equipping this great influx of fresh warriors proved an intractable problem for Kitchener. Divisions which would eventually reach the Somme only received their full quota of equipment weeks before departure. Their preparations for the front also suffered terribly from the chronic lack of experienced officers of NCOs. This was a problem which permeated the whole volunteer army. The vast majority of those charged with the leadership of the newly formed divisions were commissioned because they had attended one of England's elite public schools. The meeting of these two nations of Britain was one of the most dramatic social encounters of the century. It was a meeting which forged a bond of sympathy that would have profound consequences in the post-war world. But for now, the only thing they had in common was their inexperience. Despite this, the morale of Kitchener's army never seriously flagged. The mutual support within the PAL's regiments was tremendous. According to Private George Morgan of the West Yorkshire Regiment,
The companionship now, absolutely right. Everyone seemed to know one another. It was good. We were all traveling. We were happy, very happy. And they were such good people. They were fine young men.
as the first substantial waves of volunteers reached the shores of France early in 1916, and plans for the big push were already underway. A huge volume of men, supplies and munitions being pumped forward on trains over 40 carriages long meant innumerable delays. In the winter months, it also meant the real possibility of freezing to death. There is nothing worse for an officer or man crossing to France for the first time or coming back off leave to take part in some important fight than his railway journey to the front, wrote Captain Armes Coburn of the King's Royal Rifles. Following a series of failed offensives by the French at Arbois, Champagne, and the British at Loos, the Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces, General Joffre, commanded a fresh joint offensive for the following year. The Somme quickly became the obvious focus of attention. The initial plan envisaged that 40 French divisions would attack from the south, with 25 British divisions advancing in the north. However, this reckoned without the German assault of Verdun. On the 21st of February 1916, the bombardment of the fortress of Verdun began. Lying at the head of a salient which the French line would have been better off without, Verdun was nevertheless a symbol of French national pride. It also became a major political symbol. If Verdun fell, so too would the French government under Briand. The fortress was to be defended at all costs. By the end of June, when fighting died down, 78 French divisions had been committed to Verdun. General Pétain, charged with its defense and later to become French Commander-in-Chief, vowed, "They shall not pass." They did not pass, but only at the cost of 315,000 casualties and the near mutiny of the French army. As the appetite of Verdun for fresh corpses grew more ravenous, so the number of French divisions available for the big push diminished. Ironically, this also increased the pressure from Joffre on Haig, British Commander-in-Chief, to bring the date of the offensive forward. Politically committed to the defense of the fortress, Joffre felt that only a major offensive on another front would distract the Germans from their attack. By May, the total scale of the offensive had been substantially reduced. It was now agreed that on July 1st, approximately 12 British divisions would attack from the north, 5 French divisions from the south. The trenches which the Fourth Army occupied were typical of the British trench systems of the First World War. There were 3 or 4 lines of trenches from 100 to 400 yards apart. These lines were roughly parallel to each other. No trench ran straight for more than a few yards, which stopped the enemy from firing along its total length if one section were captured. Each trench had a parapet in front, facing out onto the barbed wire which guarded its approach. Fire bays alternated with solid earth traverses. The fire trenches were 6 to 12 feet wide at the top, narrowing to roughly 3 feet wide at the bottom. Communication trenches linked the lines together, and a wider approach trench allowed supplies and equipment to be brought forward after nightfall. The trenches required constant maintenance to prevent erosion. Pit props, railway sleepers, sandbags and brushwood were some of the materials used to shore up their sides. According to Private Archie Surtees of the 13th Battalion East Yorkshire Regiment, other materials might also be used.
The top step of our particular sinkhole consisted of a kind of soft bagging, which when wet with rain exuded a red fluid which trickled down the steps. We found it better to ignore. Conjectures are not pleasant when you come across more than one portal buried in sand forming part of the trench side.
Compared to the German trenches, the British were very crude affairs. This was a conscious tactic. According to the Field Service Pocket,
The choice of a defensive position and its preparation must be made with a view to economizing the power expended on defense in order that the power of offense may be increased.
nevertheless, until mid-1916, the Somme had not really experienced the full horror of trench warfare. When the bombardment opened on the 24th of June, this was about to change. Over the next 7 days, the German positions, cowering in their dugouts, were exposed to the earth-shattering impact of more than 1.5 million shells falling around them. British field artillery was made up of 18-pound guns generally devoted to wire cutting, and 4.5-inch howitzers mainly deployed in trench demolition. The medium artillery, consisting of 4.7-inch, 6-inch and 60-pound guns, was targeted on supply dumps, approach roads and railways. The heavy howitzers, ranging from 6 to 12 and 15-inch caliber, were used on fortified targets, such as the Germans' own gun emplacement. Further forward, the infantry used trench mortars to send 2, 3 and 4-inch shells into the enemy trenches. From the 26th of June onwards, the British began to mix gas projectiles with the high explosive and shrapnel-filled shells. Chlorine gas is one of the most terrifying weapons of the First World War. Lance Sergeant Elmer Cotton described its effects as splitting headache, with instant death, a knife-edge pain in the lungs, and a coughing up of greenish froth off the stomach and the lungs, ending finally in insensibility and death. The color of the skin, from white, turns a greenish black and yellow. The tongue protrudes and the eyes assume a glassy stare. It is a fiendish death to die. Gas was in short supply and used only intermittently in the bombardment, most of it being saved for the morning before the offensive. The tactics of the coming battle were simple in the extreme. The memorandum, Training of Divisions for Offensive Action, dated 8th of May 1916, was under no illusions about the abilities of the volunteer army. Officers and troops generally do not possess the military knowledge arising from a long and high state of training, which enables them to act promptly on sound lines in unexpected situations. The big push was to be based on the assumptions of this memorandum, that while a single line of men has usually failed, 2 lines have generally failed but sometimes succeeded, 3 lines have generally succeeded but sometimes failed, and 4 or more lines generally succeeded. The lack of training and experience was to be compensated for by sheer weight of numbers. The attackers would be organized into 4 successive lines of men no more than 100 yards apart. They would leave their trenches and advance along a front of about 15 miles, for a distance elevations which ranged from just over a mile to 2 miles, depending on the disposition of the German lines. The advance would be protected by a creeping barrage of artillery fire, behind which the infantry were expected to advance relatively unmolested. The barrage would pound the first line of the enemy defences for as long as it took the infantry to reach it. It would then move forward to the next predetermined line and shell this for the same period. The barrage would continue forward in this manner, followed by the infantry, until the attack objectives had been achieved. The infantry on the Somme were led to believe that between the damage already inflicted by the bombardment and the covering fire of the barrage, their journey across no man's land would be little more than a stroll in the country. On the eve of battle, some were beginning to have serious doubts, but most were looking forward to the coming test of their manhood. Tommy Atkins was finally going into battle.
Tommy this and Tommy that, and Tommy wait that side. With little trains for Atkins when the troop was on the side. When the troop gets on the side, the boys, the troop gets on the side. This little train for Atkins when the troop was on the side. Yes, they give more of beautiful from God, while you sleep. It's deeper than they're beautiful, but they're starving. And husband drunken souls, when they go in the bit, when it's 5 times better than they did in it. Well, it's Tommy this, and Tommy that, and Tommy out your soul. In red light of hero, when the drums begin to roll. When the drums begin to roll, the boys, the drums begin to roll. It's a red light of hero, when the drums begin to roll. Well, we are some red heroes, so we are something like us too. We're just single-headed bandits, most remarkable I do. And if sometimes our conduct is all your sacrifice, well, they don't say it's right, don't know it's the start of life. But Tommy this and Tommy that, and Tommy for the eye. When there's trouble in the wind, when there's trouble in the wind, when there's trouble in the wind, it's like the walk in faster when there's trouble in the wind.
On the 1st of July, dawn came accompanied by a slight drizzle which quickly cleared to a bright sunny morning. The men ate a last meal. For the fortunate, this came warm from the rear positions. At 6:25, the artillery flung a final colossal roar of bombardment toward the German lines. Corporal Bill Munn, East Surrey Regiment, waited with mounting tension. How the time dragged on. Would it never come? At last, 1 minute to go. Get ready. Now for it. Either deck or glory, or perhaps a nice room, good enough to get us across the water to Blighty. Finally, the bombardment ceased. The whistles of the officers shrieked out along the front, and the Battle of the Somme began. Almost immediately, German barrage fire rained down with devastating accuracy on the British forward positions.
As our infantry advanced, down came a perfect wall of explosives on the front benches of my brigade and the 93rd. It was the most frightful artillery display I've seen. Each line disappeared in a thick cloud of dust and smoke, which rapidly blotted out the whole area. I saw few groups of men in the gas and smoke cloud. I knew to get through such a fire. The whole brigade would fight out and fight.
This was the experience of Brigadier H.S. Rees, whose brigade of North of England pals attempted to advance at Serre. For those who survived the barrage, machine gun fire was waiting. A sergeant of the 3rd Tyneside Irish described how
I could see away to my left and right, long lines of men. Then I heard the patter-patter of machine guns in the distance. By the time I'd gone another 10 yards, there seemed to be only a few men left around me. By the time I had gone 20 yards, I seemed to be on my own. Then I was hit myself.
up and down the line of advance, most of the British infantry came under heavy fire within seconds of leaving their trenches. For those who managed to win through to the enemy lines, it was often the heartbreak of attempting to find gaps in the German wire where none existed. All along the front, it was almost universal, the same story of mayhem and carnage. The only sector of progress was south of La Boiselle, where divisions fighting beside the French and the French themselves made significant advances. The 21st and 34th captured long sections of German trenches, while the 2nd, 18th and 30th divisions made serious inroads into their first-day objectives. By 9 a.m., due to shock, exhaustion, counterattack and German reinforcement, the vast majority of the British infantry had lost touch with their barrage protection. It had moved ahead to rain down shells on objectives which were not only unachievable but also unreachable. Many battalions, having lost touch with their own barrage, were now cut off by the German barrage from receiving supply of reinforcement. From behind the protection of their own lines, the enemy could pinpoint these stranded British remnants and attack them with mortar, grenades, and shells. Moving forward off the rear meant exposing themselves once again to machine gun fire. Neither could they easily call on covering fire from their own artillery. Though they had been issued with a miscellaneous collection of signalling devices, including flags, discs, and carrier pigeons, none of these proved adequate for the 2-month battle. The only communications which proved reliant, comprehensive, and fast enough to be effective were those carried by the regimental runners, who risked their lives scampering heroically back to their line through the deadly hail of no man's land. Even after the slaughter of the first wave of attack, commanders were still sending battalions forward. The Newfoundland Regiment was ordered to advance towards Wye-Ravine and Beaumont Canal, although the Enniskillen Regiment had already suffered 568 casualties there. The Newfoundlanders lost 710, including all their officers. When each regiment was only putting between 700 and 800 men in the field at any one time, such losses were staggering. Officers had been instructed to lead their men forward no matter what the cost. That 60% of them fell in combat over all divisions on July 1st is testament to the fact that they took the slaughter quite literally. As the day dragged on, the carnage of the first few hours was repeated on a smaller scale throughout most of the field of battle. By night, the Somme claimed 60,000 British casualties, the highest number ever to fall in a single day. Nowhere could the attack approach the German second line, the main British objective for the first day of battle. The cost of this failure in human terms had been staggering. 20,000 human beings had died. When Corporal Joe Foyles of the 13th Battalion Rifle Brigade approached the enemy positions 7 days later, he found that
The German front line was covered with ice. There were 7 men deep. The vehicle flat. The snow. These people have remained since 1st of July.
Acting Corporal Rupert Weaver of the same regiment was transfixed by what he witnessed.
As far as you could see, all these bodies lying up there. Literally thousands of them. Some without legs. Some were legs without bodies. Arms without bodies. Chains.
For those assigned to burial detail, the task proved traumatic in the extreme.
The dead were stretched out on one side, one on top of each other, 6 foot high. I thought at the time I should never get the peculiar, disgusting smell of naked, warm human blood heated by the sun out of my nostrils. I would rather have smelled gas than the flames.
For others, it was the sight of those who still lived which was unbearable.
It was the wounded such a hell. I did not mind it. I could do nothing for them. I also felt incapable of doing much for the wounded.
The night of July the 1st, the British troops were forced to endure the eerie, demonic choir of those comrades' screams, babblings, cries, and moans echoing across the killing fields of no man's land. The effect on the nerves of the infantry was excruciating. Lieutenant Hornshaw of the West Yorkshire Regiment lightened the noise to the sound of enormous white fingers screeching across an enormous pane of glass. There were stretcher parties who braved the perils of the German machine guns to rescue some of the wounded. But, as Captain Herfen from the Rifle Brigade agonizingly inquired, what was the use of a handful of stretcher bearers to deal with literally thousands of wounded? Even those who point to the advances on the south of the battlefront as evidence that the first day of battle was not a complete military disaster cannot avoid the catalogue of tactical and strategic criticisms laid against Haig and the rest of the British High Command. There was no intelligence that the German dugouts were so deep, their strong points so well fortified, and so many gun emplacements masked. Much of the British ammunition was made up of duds which failed to explode or exploded in the breeches of the guns prematurely. German personnel and positions withstood the bombardment relatively intact. Approximately 1 million of the shells fired during the bombardment were 18-pound shrapnel, which could do little damage to earthworks or barbed wire. The British gunners were very inexperienced and poorly trained. This led to inaccuracy not just during the bombardment, but in the barrage which was meant to protect the infantry. Instead of advancing close behind their barrage, the infantry had to stand off for fear of being hit by shells dropping short. So the German defenders were given the opportunity to reorganize before the attacking wave of the British was upon them. The failure to inflict sufficient damage on the barbed wire was known by the infantry before battle commenced, but no intelligence about this was sought at command level. so orders from High Command constantly assumed major gaps in the German wire. The battle plan was crude in the extreme. No attempt was made to disguise the imminent offensive, and there was no element of surprise when the attack finally came. At first it seemed that few lessons had been learned from the debacle of July the 1st. Solid lines of infantry continued to sacrifice themselves to German machine guns. Further military gains were minor and expensive. However, on the 14th of July, Rawlinson won permission from Haig to attempt a surprise offensive. Upwards of 20,000 men attacked the sleeping German positions at 3:25 a.m. After only 5 minutes of bombardment, 5 miles of the German second line were eventually overrun. Three divisions of cavalry then struggled through the pock-marked battlefield to form up in the open ground beyond the British advance. Lances glistening in the sun, pennants bravely waving, they gathered momentum as they advanced. Then breaking into a charge, they thundered toward the German machine guns. The slaughter which followed signaled the pathetic end of the cavalry charges of tactic in modern warfare. In mid-September, the Somme saw the introduction of a weapon which would eventually replace the cavalry and revolutionize the face of battle, the tank. At the Battle of Flers-Courcelette in 1916, 49 of these 28-ton mechanical monsters lumbered towards their first offensive at a top speed of just over 3.5 miles an hour. With a crew of 8 squashed into the stifling heat of its armor-plated interior, the tank was designed to cross a 10-foot-wide trench and take out a machine gun post with 6-pounder guns or engage personnel with Vickers and Hotchkiss machine guns. On their first outing on the Somme, 17 of their tanks failed to reach the line of battle, and another 14 broke down or stalled in the mud once the battle commenced. 9 tanks survived to clear a path of their infantry, but the psychological effect of the tanks on the German defenders was out of all proportion to their number. By late September, the Germans had been pushed back over 3 miles. Weather conditions had become atrocious. According to the official history, little could be seen from the air through the rain and mist, so it was impossible to locate with any accuracy the new German trenches and shell-hole positions. Bursts of high explosive were smothered in ooze. The ground was so deep in mud that to move one 18-pounder, 10 or 12 horses were often needed. The adverse weather was also affecting the work of the Allied Air Force, an increasingly important support for the infantry as the campaign on the Somme wore on. The tasks assigned to the Royal Flying Corps were wide-ranging and included counter-battery spotting, the destruction of enemy observer balloons, photographic reconnaissance of the battlefield, and the movement of supplies and reserves immediately beyond. The RFC used DH-2 fighter aircraft on offensive patrols, which engaged the German aircraft and cleared the air ahead of any infantry attack. This allowed the aircraft in the British rear to observe the battlefield and support the troops on the ground by strafing and bombing the enemy. The cost of this belligerent approach was immense. The RFC lost 782 destroying 164 German planes and forcing down another 205. This apparent disaster was later defended by its commanders, who pointed out that the RFC's successes should be measured by its work for the army, not by its toll of enemy aircraft. The reason for the low German casualty rate was a result of hanging back beyond the line of battle and only rising to fight when they felt that the odds were in their favour. This gave the Allies complete aerial dominance over the battlefield throughout the offensive. The deluge over the Somme continued into October. It seemed that the big push was squelching ignominiously to a halt. But still the commanders ordered men forward in conditions which even the official history could not condone. Infantry, sometimes wet to the skin and almost exhausted before 0 hour, were often condemned to struggle painfully forward through the mud under heavy fire against objectives which were vaguely defined and difficult to recognize. Many of the troops now ploughing through the mud were beginning to question the wisdom of their leaders. With their growing knowledge of strategy and tactics came the realization that the extent of annihilation on July the 1st might well have been avoided. Their tendency towards cynicism was fed by newspaper accounts, which led them to question if the battle in which they were engaged was the same one being reported by the press. On July the 3rd, the Times quoted Haig as saying, "The first day of the battle had brought substantial progress. We got our first thrust well home, and there is every reason to be sanguine about the result." According to the writer C.L. Montague, those who had lived through the massacre read the stuff open-mouthed. No amount of cynicism at the front could match the gall of some of those who wrote about the war from the comfort of their clubs in London. Even after the Battle of the Somme, Lord Northby, owner of the Times, could write about conditions in the trenches.
The open-air life, the regular and plenteous feeding, the exercise, and the freedom from care and responsibility keep the soldiers extremely fit and content.
The volunteer army had been poorly trained, roughly billeted, haphazardly equipped, and subject to the squalor of the trenches. They had borne all of this, for the most part, with a patient faith in their commanders, their government, and the institutions of the nation for which they fought. Now the fabric of their belief system was being rent asunder. Some of those who had joined up with a sense of decency and fair play, like Private Hubbard of the London Scottish, were now instructed to abandon these values.
We had strict orders not to take prisoners, no matter if we were. My first job, when I had finished cutting some of the wire away, was to empty my magazine on the 3 Germans which came out of their deep dugouts bleeding badly, and put them out of their misery. They cried for mercy. I had my orders.
Private, later Sergeant Hubbard, could never forget the incident. It was believed to be a major reason for his suicide some years after the war was over. While such orders were not common, indeed sometimes it seemed success was counted by the number of prisoners taken, neither was Private Hubbard's a singular experience. Idealism may not have perished on the Somme, but it was certainly grievously wounded. The horrors which the frontline troops had endured were being sanitized by the press for an ever-credulous public. But the enormous emotion generated by the conflict had to find a voice somewhere. It discovered it in the songs and poems which emerged from the trenches of the Somme to menace the hallowed defences of the establishment. The spearhead of this attack came from the pens of poets such as Robert Graves, Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, and others, later to become known as the War Poets. Having enlisted with as much idealism as their comrades, poems like The General echoed the growing sense of bitterness and disillusionment which now began to gnaw at them.
These are cheering up the card, grunted Harry to Jack, as they slogged up to Arras with rifle and pack. But he did for them both his plan of attack.
The wounded soldier was not comfortably ensconced in a French hospital dreaming of his sweetheart and a swift return to duty.
He stirred, shifting his body. Then the pain led him like a prowling beast, gripped and tore his groping dream with grinding claws and fangs.
But the message of these poets was not just contained in their merciless descriptiveness. They celebrated life in the midst of death, the voice of nature struggling through the thunder of battle, and reasserted the sacredness of the individual against the wholesale degradation of anonymous mechanical warfare. Gethsemane by Rudyard Kipling granted the victim of warfare a holy, Christ-like quality.
The garden at Gethsemane held a pretty lass, but all the time she talked to me, prayed me come and pass. The officer sat on a chair, and then on the grass, and all the time it haunted me, I prayed my cup might pass. It didn't pass. It didn't pass. It didn't pass for me. I drank it when we met the gas. The old Gethsemane.
The ultimate enemy of these poets, and those they spoke for, inevitably became not the German enemy, but the war itself. But still the war dragged on. While Haig had decided by mid-October that the German lines on the Somme would now not be pierced before spring, he was pressurized by Jacques to keep the offensive going. A final assault was planned, but the quagmire conditions underfoot saw its continual postponement. But on the 9th of November, the weather suddenly cleared, and severe frosts began to solidify the quivering mud. 4 days later, the attack began, an hour and a half before dawn. Each morning since the beginning of the month, the German front-line trenches had been subject to an hour's heavy barrage. However, the shells falling around them on the 13th were the prelude to the advance of 7 divisions under General Sir Herbert Gough. Along a line centering on Beaumont Hamel, 44,000 mostly battle-hardened British infantrymen thrust themselves toward the German position. The troops which now swept across no man's land were not the naive amateurs of July the 1st. Once through the barbed wire, they made maximum use of what cover the terrain had to offer, avoiding strongholds and attacking vulnerable positions in small groups. While the fortified town of Serre remained in German hands, everywhere else advances were spectacular. Beaumont Hamel, considered vulnerable to the British assault, was taken by the 51st Division. The 63rd Division took Beaucourt village and pressed further into German-held territory. By November the 18th, the Battle of the Somme was over. The Allies had advanced up to 6 miles. Each mile had been bought by over 100,000 casualties. The British suffered 450,000 casualties all told. In the Second World War, the total of British losses on all fronts would not exceed 350,000. Whatever its strategic value, in human terms, the Somme had been a military disaster. Those who joined together had indeed fought together and died together. Remote districts of Scotland, Welsh mining towns, and industrial Midlands villages found a whole generation of young men wiped out at a stroke. The survivors would bring back tales of incompetence and horror, which would alter the thinking of the British public forever. The memory of what they had witnessed could only grow more vivid with time. Having fought in this most harrowing of battles, they felt charged with the responsibility somehow to communicate the pathetic, murderous indignity of the Somme to their fellow countrymen and to future generations. Do you remember the dark months you held the sector at Mametz? The nights you watched and wired and dug and piled sandbags on parapets? Do you remember the rats and the stench of corpses rotting in front of the front line trench? And dawn coming, dirty white and chilled with a hopeless rain? Do you ever stop and ask, is it all going to happen again? Do you remember that hour of din before attack? And the anger, the blind compassion that seized and shook you as you peered at the doomed and haggard faces of your men? Do you remember the stretcher cases lurching back with dying eyes and lolling heads? Those ashen grey masks of the lads who once were kind and keen and gay. Have you forgotten yet? Look up and swear by the green of spring that you'll never forget.
Okay. Hmm. My trachea. Ooh. Ooh. Cuckoo. Leah. Leah.
NASA certainly was the shining light, the benchmark of American aspirations in the 60s. The large Saturn V rocket, the lunar rover, the moon buggy, all of that was something that I wanted to do when I got older.
Well, picture if I close the
I wanted to put people on Mars. NASA certainly was aspirations in the 60s. The large Saturn V rocket, the lunar rover, the moon buggy, all of that was something that I wanted to do when I got older. I wanted to put people on the moon. I wanted to put people on Mars. I joined NASA in 1976 during the early development of the Space Shuttle program.
Pretty flare maneuver. We'll pull the nose up a little bit right before it hits the runway.
The Space Shuttle became that goal of low cost to low Earth orbit. Like it was an interim period in our history. To me, NASA's role was always to go deep into space.
Thank you. A little more than 40 years ago, astronauts descended the 9-rung ladder to the lunar module called Eden.
When President Obama made the announcement in 2010 that NASA's role is deep space,
The question for us now is whether that was the beginning of something or the end of something.
we were all excited.
I choose to believe it was only the beginning.
It's definitely a Kennedy moment when you can say we're going to do something that's never been done before, not only go to the moon, but onto Mars.
I was in high school when Barack Obama made the speech. So for me, I looked at it as an opportunity to be able to have my footprint in human exploration history.
Permanent presence on the moon. People have dreamed of this for years. The Obama decision kind of lit a little fire that has gotten bigger.
Going back to the moon and going to Mars, that's my generation of engineers who are going to be the pioneers to send humans to Mars.
For some of us that had only known low Earth orbit, it was a daunting idea.
It told us that we were going to need a tremendously large rocket.
Magnitude, both in power and in size.
Not just heavy lift, but super heavy lift.
It's NASA's most powerful rocket ever. A machine built to allow humanity to explore the moon and beyond. This is the story of the mighty Space Launch System, or SLS.
With the Space Launch System, the stars are our destination. But we haven't developed anything like SLS in literally 40 years.
And so we're having to start from scratch. Hey, how do we get to the moon? What do we need?
The questions that arise are, who has the expertise
even to do the same thing, but also to do it better or differently.
July 2013. NASA has preliminary plans for the Space Launch System, a rocket designed initially to take astronauts back to the moon on a mission that will come to be called Artemis. Engineers need to create a machine that surpasses the legendary Saturn V, the rocket that launched the Apollo moon missions. But no one has built a rocket that powerful in over 40 years.
We had nobody that had hands-on experience of a rocket like that. But we had a young cadre of engineers who really wanted to get their hands dirty.
We really didn't have a lot of hands-on experience in working with these large-scale engines.
So one of the ideas they had was to take apart a Saturn V first-stage engine.
This new F1 must perform perfectly, for more than just time and money are involved. Men's lives will depend on it.
Why don't we go get one of the F1 engines out of the Smithsonian and tear it down and reverse engineer it?
We just said, hey, let's get a big crane and let's pick it up and go put it into a big building and let's start taking it apart and seeing what made it tick. It did have a few pieces of bubble gum from being in the museum and some kids walking by and sticking some bubble gum on the side of it, but it was still in really good shape. When we started to dig into it and take it apart, there was still kerosene, there was still rocket fuel left in it from when it was tested back in the 60s. So to touch it, to smell it, to get the soot that was still on the turbine blades, it was just it just hit every sense in your body. The pride that someone had put into making these complicated and difficult welds, and they were all done by hand. To me, as an engineer, if you want to look at how well something's made, you go look at the welds, and every one of those on those rockets is flawless.
What we ended up with really is a team of hands-on engineers that were young and not ready to retire, and they wanted to go actually do this.
Saturn V may have been the inspiration, but for most of the SLS design, NASA turns to a more recent launch system.
The Space Launch System is a combination of new and old, and actually quite a bit of old. Legacy parts inherited were not just from the Apollo program, but actually from the shuttle era, which I think is maybe more relevant. Saturn V is the grandparent of SLS, and Space Shuttle is the parent.
SLS will use modified Space Shuttle main engines and enlarged versions of its solid rocket boosters, pushing them to the limit using modern digital technology.
We have taken the Space Shuttle, we've taken the orbiter off of the side of it, we've put the orbiter's engines under the bottom of the vehicle, we've lengthened the solid rocket booster, and we've stretched the tank to get more fuel on board. It sounds really simple, but there was much more complexity to doing that than first meets the eye.
With the new team in place, engineering for SLS is underway, and the first step is an essential data gathering mission.
How do we use parts that were intended for one purpose and fly them in a different environment? Aerodynamics is a huge part of building any launch vehicle. We do test models in wind tunnels up to around 13 feet long. One of the key areas we test first is this area of flow that we call transonic. And shock waves start to occur. This compression of air molecules in different parts of the rocket.
One of the complexities of SLS is due to its extreme size. The larger the structure, the lower its natural frequencies. When you go through the transonic region, shocks are trying to form on the side of the vehicle. Then you have to worry about coupling up that dynamic with the natural frequency of the vehicle. And when I say coupling, I mean that the frequency at which I'm pulsing it is also the frequency that the structure wants to respond. And so they're having a good time with each other.
In the engineering world, positive reinforcement is usually bad.
Those kind of dynamics, you can literally break things, you can cause pulses that even influence the thrust of the rocket engine.
Using a combination of aerodynamic and acoustic testing, engineers reach a troubling conclusion.
Early on, we realized that these parts that we inherited from the Legacy Shuttle program really were not capable of flying through transonic.
Rocket components are not universal. They're all designed and optimized for the vehicle that they are built for.
Space Launch System has 4 engines. The shuttle only had 3 engines. Space Shuttle had them on the back of the actual plane itself. For Space Launch System, we put them at the bottom of the barrel. So on Space Launch System now, those components are going to experience much more violent vibrations. So the size requires, as a propulsion engineer, requires us to make sure that those parts can withstand the new vibration, the new loads. We took those original components from the Space Shuttle and we had to make them thicker and beefier to deal with the weight and the structural movements and the size of Space Launch System.
Beginning in 2013, the Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans, a vital part of the Space Shuttle program, must be extensively refitted to cope with the size of SLS. But by November 2014, the first pieces of the SLS core stage are coming out of the factory.
The 8.4 meter diameter is exactly the diameter of the external tank on Space Shuttle, but we've stretched the tank to get more fuel on board.
The core stage diameter is the same as what we flew on Shuttle. But that was really not driven as much by vehicle architecture as by taking advantage of existing tooling and infrastructure capabilities. If I can use the same machines, I don't have to buy new ones.
The core stage is the biggest stage that we've ever built, and in fact, the hydrogen tank is the biggest tank we've ever built.
Each tank is made in sections joined together by a technique called friction stir welding. A spinning tool heats up the metal of the 2 edges until they become soft and stirs them together like mixing dough. The resultant joint is strong and light, but refining the process to ensure defect-free welds was a challenge.
We pushed the technology of friction stir welding with this tank. I don't think anybody's ever seen anything like it before.
With SLS, NASA is pushing at the limits of what is possible because there's a fundamental reality that governs all rockets.
You have this thing called gravity. Yet we have to overcome that and go beyond.
Behind every aspect of the SLS design is a single mathematical formula.
In order to understand how a rocket actually works, we have the rocket equation.
To me, the rocket equation, you might as well just tattoo that on my arm. It's what makes all this work.
how you're releasing mass in order to achieve an escape velocity.
You know, it's Newton's law, action and reaction. You're throwing out at fast speeds a lot of dense propellant.
You want to take your mass and you accelerate it, then it produces force, right?
The real crux of the matter of the rocket equation is I want most of the weight of my vehicle to be propellant. It puts you in a little bit of a box because I'm trying to get more and more fuel on board, that my tanks are getting bigger and bigger. Now I'm fighting the weight of the structure itself.
Every ounce of weight that I change greatly impacts the bottom line of the rocket.
There is a risk you'd have a vehicle that's too heavy and might not have enough propellant. And the rocket equation would get you again, and you'd run out of steam before you got to orbit.
That rocket equation, you know, the part that we focus on is the part we can control, right? It's a physics-based equation, and so we can control the fuel economy and how do we optimize the mass. I don't want to say minimize the mass, I want to say optimize the mass. Because it takes mass to build a structure that can handle the loads that we put it through.
And there is a limit to how big you can make something.
In April 2017, the first completed section of the core stage begins a 1,240-mile journey from New Orleans to Alabama. The engine section test article will be carried on NASA's Pegasus barge to the Marshall Space Flight Center. There, it will undergo structural tests to ensure it can withstand the forces created by 8.8 million pounds of thrust at launch.
Many different components of the Space Launch System lie within that one engine section. I would even say about 80% of the parts that go into the core stage is in the engine section. It's one of the most important segments of the core stage for the Space Launch System because it attaches the RS-25 engines.
Sixteen shuttle main engines were left over after the shuttle program ended in 2011. Called RS-25s, they already have a proven track record.
The RS-25 engine, it's a seasoned veteran. It's been aging well, like wine, right? It gets better as we age it because we implement improvements.
To a car guy, I would say they are the Rolls Royces and the Ferrari together as an engine. I have to put this in there as well. They also have a little Prius built in there.
In 2014, NASA begins shipping all 16 engines to Stennis Space Center, where they must be refitted for the Space Launch System.
We needed to adapt those engines. It's a different rocket. There were interfaces that had to be dealt with. Physical, mechanical interfaces, hydraulics, gases, propellant, a lot of things to think about.
The engines burn liquid hydrogen and oxygen to create superheated water that exits the nozzle at 13 times the speed of sound, creating huge thrust.
When we first started on the shuttle, our engines ran at, I'll call it design thrust, 100%. Vehicle guys always want more power. Going to the SLS, the first flight will be at 109, not 100%. Eventually, we're going to go to higher power levels, 111%.
That's what NASA's aiming for, is 111% of the rated power, which is quite a boost over the shuttle era.
In 2015, NASA begins testing all 16 RS-25 engines at the Stennis Space Center. It's a risky business, pushing the engines to their limits and preparing them for their ultimate mission.
So, you know, in terms of increasing the thrust level of the RS-25 engine, we're increasing the mass that we're flowing, but we also increase the pressures that we see. If you start increasing pressures, then you also have higher temperatures.
The turbo pumps have to be moving at faster rotational speeds. And you can imagine all of those things stress the material more and more.
So it is that fine balance, that dance, if you will. Any change that you make affects not only the rocket engine, but it could affect the vehicle as a whole.
For this vehicle, you know, it makes sense to make these engines expendable.
The Space Shuttle main engine, or now the RS-25, was designed to be reusable. The Space Shuttle was that. It was a reusable vehicle. It went to low Earth orbit. It came back. The mission for SLS is different. We're going to the moon and beyond. So when we get to main engine cutoff, you're well out of the atmosphere. So there's really no way to bring those engines back.
So you no longer have to design your engine for an extended life. And now that you have that shorter lifespan, then you could push your components to higher pressures, higher temperatures that may degrade its life, but since we're no longer reusing it, we're able to push those boundaries even farther.
Those are the trades you have to make. We could not afford to carry the additional weight and complexity associated with reusability. But it hurts to throw away RS-25 engines.
I don't know, how do you say it? It's a little bit disappointing, but we're going to the moon. I mean, if you're gonna be used for the last time in an expendable vehicle, going to the moon, that's pretty cool.
We want to use those engines because no one's ever turned down high thrust and high fuel economy. Nobody's ever said, oh, I don't want those things on a rocket. And that drives this requirement of having these cryogenic propellants.
Hydrogen is the most efficient known rocket propellant, but it has a very low density. Storing it and the oxygen needed to burn it, even in liquid form, requires huge tanks and very low temperatures. Any leakage creates a risk of catastrophic explosion.